Hello, General Biology, and welcome to the next screencast series on Chapter 2, and this is Section 2.3, and this is the first screencast for 2.3, and we're going to learn about carbon compounds. When I was in college, we referred to this as organic chemistry, and it still has that title today. Because the things that make up living systems, as you're reading here on this slide, is that they are fundamentally different from the compounds of non-living things. And what makes them so different is they contain carbon as the backbone of a lot of the compounds that make up the living things. So I use the term backbone. What do you think backbone means? Backbone, when you think of humans that have a backbone, doesn't that kind of support everything? Our ribs come off of it, our arms come off of it, our legs come off of it, and it's a support, it's a framework for us. And that's the same idea that we're talking about here with carbon compounds. It's going to be the framework for chemical compounds that make up living systems. So we're going to really rely on some of the periodic table of elements like hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen and sulfur and phosphorus that are going to be able to bond with carbon to form compounds that make up living systems. We're going to see relationships between those valence electrons. And what are valence electrons? Do you remember from the first section of this chapter? Hopefully you're saying, oh, Mrs. Saunders, those are the outermost electrons in an element. And yes, you're right. And then we're going to focus on bonding. One of the things that we're going to see is that most of the carbon compounds that are formed bond covalently. They share electrons. But we're also going to see important relationships for chemical reactions that happen with ionic bonding. So let's take a look at carbon and see why carbon is so important in making up life's molecules. So there's a couple of unique things about carbon, and one of those unique things is that it has 4 valence electrons. So if we were to draw carbon with its valence electrons, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the way that they could pair together, or not pair together, but circle around. Or they could pair together like this, or they can pair together like this, or, we can have arrangements like that. So because of those 4 valence electrons, we can have other elements that could easily bond with the electrons that are available here. And that's one of the reasons why carbon is such a great molecule for living systems. And the type of atoms that can bond, as you see here, are hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, and nitrogen. Those are the most common, and those are the ingredients that we have that make up the living systems. So we have this amazing molecule that can actually form a backbone. All right, let's take a look a little bit further into this. So one of the things that I didn't mention is that even carbon can bond with itself. That's one of the characteristics that it has. So take a look here. This is something new. We haven't really seen this. I haven't talked about it in any previous screencast. This line represents a bonding pair. Okay, so that's a bonding pair of electrons. That tells me that there's 2 electrons that are bonded here. Notice we have three lines here, and this is a triple bonding pair. So a triple bond. We have 2, and this is a double bond. So when we say triple, that means that there's 6 electrons that are bonded together here, double, there's 4 electrons bonded here, and a single bonding pair. Remember, we know we have 2 electrons that are bonded there. Okay, take a look. Look at how great carbon is at bonding. So here's 2 carbons. This would make a backbone, and it has 2 hydrogens off of it. We've got a carbon, a carbon, a carbon, and a carbon that have bonded together, which leaves space for hydrogens to bond, and that carbon backbone. Here's another ring of carbons that you see here that have bonded together and form this ring shape. And then we've got the hydrogens that are coming off of it. And we're just showing you ones with hydrogen in our examples, but keep in mind, again, they can have sulfur and nitrogen and oxygen, and we'll see some of those examples later on in different things that we discuss throughout the year. And take a look at this. This is kind of like branches, but here's our carbon that you can see. Let me get my arrow. Here's our carbon backbone that you see here, and it can form this branching structure. So what this means is that carbon can form these amazing molecules that could either be a chain, and this is a good example of a chain. They could form a ring structure like you see here, and this would be considered a single ring structure, or they can form compounds that branch, and this is branching. So we've got these big, huge, complex compounds that can form as a result of carbon being the backbone, and these make up what we know as macromolecules. And these macromolecules are essential to living systems. All right, let's take this one step further. Okay, so I said a macromolecule, and the screen says many of the organic compounds in living cells are macromolecules or giant molecules. That's what macro means. Macro is big, macro is huge. So these are going to be giant molecules, and they're made from thousands or even hundreds of smaller molecules. And those smaller molecules we're going to call monomers. Okay, that's a term that you're going to have to know. We're going to work with that term throughout the school year, so you need to be comfortable with monomers. And if it helps, think of them like single pieces to the puzzle of a giant molecule. They're small compounds. They're smaller compounds that can join together to make these larger macromolecules. So if we join these monomers together and we make a segment or a piece of a macromolecule, that process is known as polymerization. So polymerization is putting the pieces of those puzzles together. They're putting the pieces of that compound together. So we're going to take a look at some of the major macromolecules that are responsible for living systems and transmitting messages in living systems and providing energy and building the living systems that we are familiar with. So again, just a reminder as we look at the screen, the smaller units of these macromolecules are called monomers. And when you get monomers joining together, they form polymers. That process of monomers making polymers is known as polymerization. And one of the things that you also need to know, as this says, is that monomers in a polymer may be identical or different. And we're going to see again examples of that as we look ahead here. Okay, we'll watch this video clip in class. Okay, there are 4 groups of macromolecules that are found within living systems that we're going to consider. We're going to talk about carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids, and proteins. We're even going to do a lab on this, so a really big lab. So that tells you the importance of these molecules. So let's focus with carbohydrates. Carbo. There's our carbon, carbo. Hydrate, what do you think hydrate means? Did you ever hear It's so hot and humid out today, you've got to hydrate. Hopefully you're saying water. And that's what carbohydrates are. They're made up of carbon and water, and they are our quick energy sources. Okay, because they're made up of carbon and water, they can easily break down. You don't have to exercise or anything. Your body can just break them down really easily. So carbohydrate, since they're carbon and water, that tells you that they're made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms that come together. And when we look at and we think about, okay, what is our list of ingredients? What's our formula? How much do we actually have? Well, on average, and this is just an average, it comes in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So let's take a look at our little model that we have over here, and this is glucose. And glucose has the chemical formula C6H12O6. Okay, let's check that and see if it's right. We should have 6 carbons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We do. We have 6 carbons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay? We should have 12 hydrogens. Well, that tells us we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Oh, wow, we've got 12 hydrogens. And then we should have 6 oxygens. There's 1 oxygen, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And when it chemically comes together, it makes this single ring structure that we have, this glucose molecule, and that's what the molecule would actually look like in chemistry. So take a look at our numbers here. Is this a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio? Can we reduce this to 1 to 2 to 1? Yes, we can. And that's typical of a carbohydrate. Even if I had sucrose, which sucrose is C11H22O11, that tells me I'm going to have 11 carbons, 22 hydrogens, 11 oxygens, and that too is a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Okay, let's talk about the significance of carbohydrates. Living things, as I already said, use this as their main source of energy. They're sugars. This is one carbohydrate is a sugar. There goes that line again. So carbohydrates are going to be sugars. They're going to be starch. And they're going to be cellulose. And we'll talk more about each of those. Glucose, when we look at this glucose molecule, this is our main source that we get for energy for the cellular activities that go on, cellular metabolism. This is going to be really important in photosynthesis and cellular respiration, so we'll be looking at that later on. Plants and animals use the carbohydrates as well for structural purposes. I mentioned cellulose up here, and cellulose is what is in plants. It's referred to as plant fiber that helps give it that crispness and gives it support for that. So those are carbohydrates. Many organisms are going to store sugar into what we call complex carbohydrates. And complex carbohydrates, other than what we saw with glucose, are polymers. And they are made by smaller carbohydrates. You know, I'm watching our clock. We're running out of time. I'm going to end this here, and we'll come back and we'll talk about complex carbohydrates in the next screencast.